Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet podcast. Maybe I should say, Jonathan, I am Yonit Levy from the newly crowned most expensive city in the world.
I know. I knew you were going to kind of brag about that because what do you think it makes me feel? I'm sitting here in London in the 17th.
Didn't make the cut of the top 10, is all I'm saying.
It didn't make the cut. And it's so funny because, you know, the Guardian reported this story saying, it's this unwanted title to be the most expensive city. And that's obviously definitely true, but you kind of don't want to be the 17th most expensive either, because it's like living in a sort of, downward neighborhood.
You read the reporting in Israel, and it's like, we kicked Paris off the top of the list, and you're like, are we actually bragging a little bit about this? It's like, we wanted to be first place in something. So yay for us. It's like Lily Tomlin had this line. She said, when I was growing up, I wanted to be somebody. I should have been more specific. So we wanted to be first place. We just should have been more specific about it.
Because the one everyone wants is the most livable city, which I think is always kind of Vancouver. And you don't want to be the most expensive city because it's hard to live in a really expensive city.
Tell me about it.
But tell you about it. We have told listeners about it. This is what I wanted to say. We're talking about bragging and a humble brag. I have to do a little bit of bigging up of our own podcast because a couple of weeks ago, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, our guest was Guy Rolnick, who talked about and answered the question, why is living in Israel, and I think we said specifically Tel Aviv, so expensive? We tackled that, Unholy listeners. You were ahead of The Economist because you were listening to Unholy, so you knew this, and there is a trend here. I know this is not very British to big oneself up in this fashion, but it's got to be said. You, Yonit, I think were the very first pundit who I heard saying, look, Naftali Bennett could be prime minister. Months even before, I think, it was even a glimmer of possibility. You were saying it on this podcast. We talked about how Tel Aviv is the most expensive place. On this podcast, we talked about Eric Zemmour, who has made it official and this week said he is running for the presidency of France. Okay, maybe you didn't have to have a crystal ball for that one, but you got it here first. And I think our podcast, correct me if I'm wrong, I think our podcast ended last week with us saying a fifth wave of coronavirus was predicted and coming. Israeli officials had said that, and we'd barely put down the microphone and suddenly we were talking about Omicron.
I'm so proud of you doing this. You're British and Jewish, which, to be honest, means a double dose of self-deprecation. And just to have you willing to stop and say, I was good at this. I'm proud of you, Jonathan Friedland.
No, you see there, you're not listening too attentively there, because if you notice, I bigged up everybody else except me there. It was Guy Rolnick, it was you. So I'm still holding on to my British credentials and Jewish credentials. I've bigged up you and Guy and the podcast itself.
And Lior, our executive producer. There is no I in Unholy. That's what you're trying to say. Great. So wait, let me pick up on what you were saying about COVID, which is where we left off last time, really talking about your concerns about a fifth wave. As you said, I think less than 24 hours later, the prime minister here spoke of a state of emergency vis-a-vis this new variant called Omicron, and Israel closed its border for tourists. Look, what I think is important to still say is that the preliminary data is that the booster shots are still pretty effective against this variant. And I think that's really important. We tend to criticize Israel a little bit. I'm an Israeli, so criticizing the country and the government is our national pastime. But I think in this case, we really have to stop and say, this was Israel being very bold. Not only the prime minister, by the way, the officials of the Ministry of Health and the data researchers were the first people in July to say, guys, the doses are waning. The efficacy is wearing out. We need to give a booster shot. This is before anyone else in the world was doing it, right? Israel decided to go for it. And then the US followed suit. And then the UK followed suit. It appears that your prime minister and my prime minister are WhatsApping each other on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So this decision saved lives. It saved lives, and it's saving lives all over the world. And I think that this combination of smart, officials and bold decisions really saved the day.
Yeah, no, and again, on Unholy, Sharon Alroy Price talked about exactly this and how boosters was the, not quite magic bullet, but it was the thing, and that Israel went out ahead first on that. I thought it's interesting that, again, on this same point, Naftali Bennett was saying we're going to go in very hard with restrictions now about Omicron in terms of travel, and I think allowing no new travellers into the country for at least 2 weeks just to see. And saying, the clip of him I heard was saying, we're going to act hard, fast, strong, quick, like all those words, in order for it to almost be a kind of brand about Israel, not only the most expensive city in the world in Tel Aviv, but also like decisive and all in on COVID. And it's interesting because you're right. He and Boris Johnson are talking to each other, and yet they are a real study in contrast, because Boris Johnson has done a couple of things about masking, but not gone the full way, not imposed all the kinds of restrictions, even demanding tests before people fly into the country, not doing that, even though the opposition are demanding it. So Israel is got this position to itself as being the kind of, partly trailblazer, but also the number one for acting very, very strongly on it. Whether that works out or not, it's decided that's its position.
Right, and if we're kind of looking at what Israel is doing, so we are hearing the first whispers of the idea of compulsory, mandatory vaccinations. I think it's more kind of a trial balloon hovering over Israelis and letting them know that the officials are talking about this. I don't think it can work in Israel. Honestly, I don't think it can work in any country that is not authoritarian. But this is something that Israelis have been talking about, because also we mentioned this. There are 1 million Israelis who got their first 2 doses and didn't get the booster shot. And there are 700,000 Israelis, again, out of a population of 9 million, who haven't been vaccinated at all. So this is kind of hovering as well in the conversation already.
And this leads us to a whole question about, vaccine hesitancy. And there is some vaccine people who genuinely hesitate. They might do it. There's vaccine apathy, which is what I think you're describing there. People who've had the first 2, but kind of can't be bothered to get the third.
Right.
But there is also the anti-vax phenomenon. And my impression is that exists in both Britain and Israel. It's massive, though, in the United States, where it's become this huge political thing. But there is a particularly sort of unholy-ish angle on this, which is the register, the kind of idiom that some parts of the anti-vax movement have used, which is right in our kind of zone. And for a feel for that, I think we ought to hear this clip from American televisions. I think it comes from Fox News, and it is once quite esteemed reporter, but now I think more of a pundit, Lara Logan. Let's just hear what she said on Fox.
And so in that moment, what you see on Dr. Fauci, this is what people say to me, that he doesn't represent science to them. He represents Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor who did experiments on Jews during the Second World War and in the concentration camps. And I am talking about people all across the world are saying this, because the response from COVID, what it has done to countries everywhere, what it has done to civil liberties, the suicide rates, the poverty, it has obliterated economies. The level of suffering that has been created because of this disease is now being seen in the cold light of day, i.e. the truth. And people see that there's no justification for what is being done.
I mean, notice, by the way, the sort of Trumpian technique there of other people are saying this. This is what I hear all the time, right? This comparison of Anthony Fauci to Joseph Mengele, I mean, offensive on so many levels, but not unique to to this one reporter making this point, or TV talking head making this point. This has been a feature of the anti-vax movement, this invocation of Nazism, with anti-vaxxers wearing the yellow star, now saying that Fauci is Mengele. The theme here is so bizarre, because we were used to, I think, being really offended when people compared a bad thing that was definitely bad to something that was much, much worse. So they would compare something bad happening in the world to the Holocaust. And we would say, that's offensive, that trivializes the Holocaust, this battle here, or this, terrible storm isn't the Nazis. This is a new thing where you say, doing something good for people, giving them a vaccine that might save their life, is somehow analogous to Nazi treatment of Jews. I mean, it's not just sort of trivializing, it's something so much worse.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, the noise you now hear is the sound of my mind boggling. I mean, look, either you don't know anything about the Holocaust, or you don't know anything about vaccines, or likely you don't know anything about both. And as you said, it's a vile comparison. not only because you're cheapening the Holocaust, but you're getting in the way of fighting a global pandemic. Both things are terrible. And the interesting thing, Jonathan, is that the anti-vaxxers in this country, who are really supposed to know better, right, because at least we're very good at Holocaust education, are using the very same terminology, the yellow stars. All of it is happening in Israel as well. Now, again, this is a fringe group, but they're still, they're creating a situation in which the officials at the Ministry of Health are walking around with security details. So you don't have to be a mass movement for it to be aggressive or even frightening. This is happening in this country as well.
So now my mind is boggling. The idea of Jews and Israelis who, as you say, should know better, thinking that your opposition to a vaccine puts you in the position of wearing a yellow star. It's, it says a few things that in Western culture now almost, I think we've known this for a while, but the Holocaust is the kind of terminus case. It's used always as the ultimate expression of anything tyrannical, evil, oppressive. We've known that. But as I say, the flip here is the equation of an attempt to do good for people, to give them a vaccine to save them from a disease, to be compared to, as she used the phrase, medical experiments or, gas chambers. It is just hideous, even if you think that the, vaccine is questionable, which is obviously you have to get into their heads. If you think it's a bad thing, it's not in this zone. And the evidence to think it's a bad thing is so lacking when you have every day out of the United States comes more news of some anti-vaccine advocate dying of COVID. It keeps happening where people who are going on air on these TV talk shows and radio shows saying don't get the vaccine, the conservatives on talk radio in America, one or two of them, three or four of them, they're dying because they are not protected.
I have to tell you of a conversation I overheard this week. An 8-year-old boy asking his father, why do I need to get vaccinated? And his father gave him an answer I really liked. He said, there are rare opportunities in life to help save the world. You can maybe assume that it's a conversation that happened in my living room. That's why I overheard it. But what I liked about this answer so much is that it reminds us, not only is it's a very Jewish answer, but it reminds us of the responsibility, right? Mass immunization is predicated upon the mass. The more people get vaccinated, more people are protected. That's how it works. It's simple. It's genius. That's how it works. And it's not only the responsibility for our bodies, our parents, our children. It's the responsibility we have to get rid of this as quickly as possible. And I think the anti-vaxxers, again, I'm having a very hard time getting into their heads, but you're abdicating. You're not only, doing something dangerous for yourself, you're abdicating your responsibility for the rest of the community.
Yeah, no, I remember vaguely from my undergraduate courses in philosophy, the notion of sort of selfish altruism. The self-interested altruism. And this is one of those really rare cases. It's good for you and it's good for other people. And you're right. What you overheard in your living room is a very Jewish perspective. That line, it's now almost cliche, to save one life is to save the world. And, by getting vaccinated, you might very, very well save your own life, but you also protect those who come into contact with you. Look, people can have a principled opposition to the vaccine. I don't get it, but okay. But it isn't Hitler and it isn't Mengele and somebody.
And the fact we even have to say this
for
out
God's
loud
sake, and the
is
idea
ridiculous.
And there's somebody with a prominent platform, and we've both been saying she was at one point quite an esteemed journalist. I don't know what's happened to her, but it's okay. So that's something. We're doing almost advanced chutzpah there. It's worse than chutzpah. We condemn it on unholy. I wanted to talk about something which, on its face, you would think, "Come on, is this really worthy of the full spotlight, the full tractor beam of unholy's attention?" And that is, it's small because it's going on, at the University of Toronto. A resolution.
Oh, look at you talking about the Commonwealth.
For our North American listeners, the University of Toronto's Scarborough campus is in the news. Not normally in the forefront of our attention, but because of a resolution, a BDS resolution, a boycott, divestment, sanctions, that campaign. We talked about that not long ago in the issue about Sally Rooney and not wanting her novel published in Hebrew if it was going to be published by an Israeli translator that didn't comply with BDS standards, and we talked about that. But this thing that's happened in University of Toronto, I think, is really interesting because it goes to something we sort of touched on there. And that is they've passed this resolution essentially, prohibiting goods or services or events which are implicated in what it calls Israeli apartheid. But they offered an exception, partly because of something that had happened on the campus before, an exemption from the policy for kosher food products if no alternatives are available. So it said Jewish students on campus, the quote is, efforts should be made to source kosher food from organizations that do not normalize Israeli apartheid. However, recognizing the limited availability of this necessity, then exceptions can be made if no alternatives are available. And a lawyer and sometime law professor by the name of David Schraub has done a very good blog about it. You can find it at the debate link. Maybe we'll include that in the episode notes. But he puts his finger on something really interesting about this, which is, okay, so this is what happens when you get into BDS. The people who it affects most tend to be Jews outside Israel, not Israel itself. But also you get into this situation where other authorities, frankly, non-Jewish authorities, start policing Jewish life and behavior. You imagine some student council looking at, knishes and Viennas and burgers and say, and kugel, and saying that's allowed, that isn't allowed. And that is a really uncomfortable image historically, and it's sort of where you get to. He said some other interesting things about it, but I want to know how you see this, Yonit, because to me, it's a niche example, but I think it goes to something sort of.
No, I don't think it's niche, because it's happening more and more, and we find ourselves on this podcast talking about these things more and more. As you said, obviously you're not hurting one bamba or hummus factory in Israel, right? You're hurting Jewish students who you're policing, as you said. You're trying to control what kind of food they're eating. And that, I think, goes into very dangerous realms, right? Trying to control what Jewish students are eating and telling them if it's okay or not is very problematic. Who exactly is going to tell you what organizations do or do not normalize apartheid? There are so many questions around this. Look, I think you, as usually astutely pointed out to, I think, what the main problem here is. And this is trying to separate or to disentangle Jews from Israel, right? And basically say, we have no problem with Jews, but we have problems with the state of Israel. You cannot do that. Either you're ignoring the fact or you're, pretending to ignore it. You can't detach Jews from Israel, because they're bound up together. They are connected. So you're, as you said, you're hurting Jews in diaspora. And another thing, Jonathan, how exactly is this really advancing Palestinians' plight and the Palestinian cause? What are you doing here? In general, right? The BDS movement in general is I think we are at a point where we can ask if it's not completely counterproductive. You're creating a situation when Israelis are digging in, right? They're not going to let the University of Toronto or anybody else dictate their policies, by the way, rightfully so. And the Palestinians are digging in because they're saying, hey, we have all this support. Why do we need to make the hard decisions that we need to make? So I don't even understand that at the end of the day, besides, as I tell you this on occasion and you get miffed on occasion, but I say, besides being cool, right, and being on topic in the university, what else are you trying to achieve here?
No, I think, it's funny because I always try in my own mind even actually to give the benefit of the doubt, because I know, look, there are people who feel strongly about Israel and about Israel's occupation of the West Bank, and they want to do something. And obviously, it's absolutely right that anything physical or involving violence is off the table. It has to be non-violent. And then something comes along which they say, look, this is non-violent. And then people still say, no, look, you can't do that either. And so I do see the problem, what form of political protest is viable. But the trouble with this, I think the reason why I particularly mentioned that blog by David Schraub is I think it does put its finger on something so important, which, as you say, it obviously doesn't affect Israel itself, because, the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, it is not in a position to regulate the Israeli state, right? So it's going to have no effect on that. Its impact will be on Jewish life. And an example that was going through my mind from this country was that a few years back, the UK Jewish Film Festival had always used a venue in London called the Tricycle Theatre. It worked out very well. And the Tricycle said, look, you can come back, but we don't want you having turned out to be a very small amount of sponsorship from the Israeli embassy in London. So as long as you cut off the link to the Israeli embassy, we're delighted to host you. And the film festival had to explain, look, this link to the Israeli embassy isn't about a link to, Netanyahu's government. It's about the state of, the people of Israel. But in a way, it's almost more than that. It's what business is it of these other institutions to tell Jews how they can mark their own Jewish life? And I agree with you. I think what there's a desire almost on behalf of a lot of anti-Zionist activity to pretend Zionism is on a different planet and has no link to Jews. We love Jews. We have no problem with Jews and Judaism. It's only Zionism. Well, what is Zionism about? It's about the movement of Jewish people, and you just can't really. That is a circle you cannot square, and they sort of don't really want to get there. I spoke to one person about this week who says, you could almost think this was a strategic goal of the BDS movement, is to deny diaspora Jews the space for any non-political connection or engagement with Israel, to say that every contact is inherently political, the kosher food even on the campus, all but kosher food on the campus. And the result of that will be to kind of redefine Jewish identity and to say, look, Jews as diaspora, no problem, but you are not allowed. We, these non-Jewish institutions, are saying you cannot have an identity that centers on or even has a relationship with the largest Jewish community or society in the world, the Jewish community of Israel. And then you
have to ask if they would dare do that to anyone else, right?
Well, certainly that perennial question. But I as I say, it's a very specific example, but I think it goes to something that, in my own thinking, I hadn't quite nailed down about in the Sally Rooney case, but I think this case really illustrates it very directly. Not necessarily very cheerily, but very directly. Oh, I just thought there was a Hanukkah angle on this too, which I haven't even mentioned.
Go ahead, my friend.
We are enjoying Hanukkah. The other example of it just was that lots of organizations have done this lovely thing, which is sending out, on social media, Hanukkah greetings to their followers, online football clubs. All the Premier League football clubs have been doing Happy Hanukkah. And it's just been very noticeable that immediately, directly below this greeting, a Jewish greeting about a Jewish festival to Jews, immediately there's this string of messages below on Twitter or whatever saying, free Palestine, Palestinian flags, etc., as if it's about Israel. This thing of the two always being tangled up, it's pretty depressing to constantly say to Jews, you're nothing unless you're prepared to sort of take responsibility for Israel. The thinking is very contradictory, I think, and it's a bit depressing.
It's setting a trap for Jews, right? And maybe that's the goal, right? As you said, it's to pressure Jews around the world to influence Israel's policies, which they have absolutely no effect over. It's just, you can't win with this. And I feel like we need to move on to something menschy, because just help us.
Yeah, to cheer us up, because it's Hanukkah.
A little bit.
Well, I was going to nominate as my mensch somebody who has been delighting people, I think, the world over this week. In fact, since the start of Hanukkah. And that person is Peter Jackson, the film director behind Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and those movies, has made 3 very long films and they're streaming on the Disney Plus channel under the title Get Back. It's his own recut of the hours and hours and hours of footage that was shot in 1969 as the Beatles were rehearsing for what they thought was going to be a big live show. In the end, it was a very short but amazing live show that became the Let It Be album, and the show was that rooftop concert. And it's just an amazing it's nearly 8 hours, but it is just a thing of beauty. There are moments in it which are beautiful. And it's, if you're a Beatle fan, which I think covers a lot of the world, then Peter Jackson has given us a great treat.
Okay, I thought we were going to nominate you, which I know we can't do for ethic reasons. But just the piece you wrote about the Peter Jackson documentary I urge all of our listeners to read it if they haven't yet. It just shot up into my ever-expanding list of favorite Jonathan Friedman columns. And it's beautiful, and I think that only you, I don't want to embarrass you by reading out paragraphs to you, but only you could write something original about the Beatles in the year 2021. So it's beautiful.
Are you a Beatles fan? Are Beatles songs in your household?
How can you not be a Beatles fan? Isn't that just like defining, are you a human being?
Yeah, I agree.
I was just concerned whether we're not, there's no Jewish angle. Oh dear. And then I remembered Brian Epstein. So I'm
who they refer to in the films, it's very sweet. They refer to him as Mr. Epstein all the way through. This proper respect for him. And they say they're missing a daddy figure because he's no longer there. No, my Jewish angle was going to be, I'm not just saying this, I always had the sense that the Beatles were sort of alive in Israel longer than elsewhere, because you would hear Beatles songs on the radio in Israel all the time. I don't know if it's still true.
Still do.
Right? But more than you would here, actually. And,
really?
Yeah.
Really?
And I remember on the old Voice of Peace, from broadcasting from somewhere in the Mediterranean, the Beatles Hour. There was a whole hour every single day, and radio stations here.
A.B. Nathan thought it would bring peace to do
all
an hour
you need
of
is
the
love
Beatles.
and give peace a chance. But, when people here had stopped doing that, Israelis were still doing it. So there's my Israeli angle.
Right. And I just want to point out that you're really lucky to have a television. My television was taken over by two very sweet girls who are watching Frozen for the 700th time this week. In a week. And so I'm just saying, I keep hearing, do you want to build a snowman? I don't want to build a snowman. It's 25 degrees outside. So that has been my week. You can't see even the best film in the world, which is, of course, Casablanca. We're not going to fight about this. We're just not.
No, I think
so you can't watch it 700 times a week. That's it. That was my short rant. That has nothing to do with the Beatles. I just had to throw it in there. And chutzpah?
Yes.
Chutzpah. Chutzpah is a tough, fierce competition this week.
It's a crowded field.
It's crowded. We have, Donald Trump for not telling anyone he had COVID and then going on the debate stage with Joe Biden, according to a new book. It's, of course, Naftali Bennett, who urged all Israelis not to go abroad because of the new variant, and then his own wife and children are, of course, going on vacation. But Jonathan, I will choose eventually to nominate Rafaela Plastira, who's a Greek model, who made it very clear that she will not be participating as Greece's representative to the Miss Universe pageant because it is in Israel. Bold statement, which no doubt brings Palestinian self-determination that much closer. But there's a little caveat in this whole thing, because the organization that chooses the country's entry to the Miss Universe pageant said she indeed won't be participating because she isn't the country's choice, but rather an entirely different Greek model who actually won. And she indeed arrived in Israel. This is a great story. I have to say, I'm a little bit torn between the fact that the organizers managed to, weather the storms of boycotts and COVID and actually have this in Eilat, this contest. I'm just saying that I still think beauty pageants should be erased from the face of the earth, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, if you think that there should be a beauty pageant at all, that's a first question. But if once you've made that decision, the chutzpah to say that I'm not going to be taking part when you weren't actually chosen is so fantastic. And it gets very close to almost, I think, that kind of Leo Rosten Joys of Yiddish definition of chutzpah.
Yep.
It's me saying, I refuse to go to the state dinner that Boris Johnson is hosting. I wasn't invited, but I refuse to go. It's got kind of Jewish joke sort of cadences to it. The beauty pageant candidate who's boycotting, who just wasn't selected. But that's interesting that Greece won. So in a way, it's a kind of, there's a little bit of poetic.
Oh, it didn't win yet. I'm not sure. I didn't follow it closely. I think the competition didn't happen yet. But everyone's here. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm like in the news, but I'm not updated about this.
No, for some reason, I'm not surprised that Yonit Levy is not hanging on the exact breakdown of results from Eilat as the Miss Universe election is decided.
No, not this year. I'm busy.
For some reason, I'm not hugely surprised. If you like seeing into the future and using us as your crystal ball, that telling you what is going on in the world, weeks before it happens, I must tell you to recommend Unholy to your friends and to review, subscribe, rate, do all the things that you do wherever you get your podcast. Please do that. It really helps us. It's like self-interested altruism, just to bring us back to that. It really is.
You know what else is self-interested altruism? Sending me some money. I live in a very expensive city, Jonathan. You're a best-selling author. Send money. I will say thank you to Lior Friedman, our executive producer, Rom Atik, Omer Primat, and Irad Eshel. And we shall meet next week.
See you there.